All right. So when we think about delivering nitrogen in the form of microbes or microbial metabolites, what does that look like in terms of actual practical application? This actually ties back to this concept. You know, I'm so intrigued that back in the 50s and 60s, they didn't have the scientific capabilities and technologies that we do now, and yet they grasped, William Albrecht and many other researchers still grasp these foundational concepts. William Albrecht made the comment that plant nutrients should be available, but not soluble. And he made some other much more outspoken comments on that one as well. And that's really what we're talking about, is we're talking about nutrition that is available to plants, but it's not water soluble. And actually, that happens to be a really big deal in Kentucky. The problem with water-soluble nutrients is that they're soluble in water, which means that when you get 6 inches of rain, where's your nutrition? It's gone. It also means when you have 3 weeks of dry weather with no rain, what's your nutrient availability? It's zero. So this is the foundation. I promised I would try to keep the time short here to open for Q&A. But let me say it this way. With biological nutrition, you can deliver nutrition to the crop in the absence of free soil water. So if you have soil that is composed of sand, silt, and clay fractions, clay particles have this very thin, well, all soil particles do, but particularly important for clay, they have this thin film of water around each clay colloid, around each clay plate, that is called adsorbed water. And this adsorbed water layer is it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 to 70 microns thick. It's very, very thin. So if you have soil that has a clay content, when you have soil that is completely saturated, that's what we call field capacity. You have a water column, you add 1 drop of water at the top and 1 drop drops out the bottom. That's field capacity. If you have clay soil, so you call that 100% capacity. A soil with a high clay content that is physically dry, it is dusty dry, like you can crumble it in your hand if it's the type of clay that you can crumble, and you can blow dust, you can make dust out of it. That soil at dusty dry will still have 70% of the water content that it had at 100% field capacity. Some really interesting. You're not losing 20% or you're not losing 50% or 70% of the water. You're only losing 30%. You go from 100% to 70%. I'm specifically speaking about clay soils. This is very true for clay. Now, if you're at 70% moisture content, the key is that when you have this dusty, dry soil, plants are going to start wilting. Plants cannot get the water that is on that clay colloid because it's too thin. The layer is too thin. The layer is smaller than the smallest root hairs. So plants can't get that water on the clay colloid, but fungi can, and bacteria can. They live in that thin film of water. And so when you have this biological process working, biology, fungi and bacteria and protozoa and other organisms, they can deliver water to a plant in the absence of free soil moisture. So this is how you drought-proof a crop. It's also how you make sure you maintain nutrition in high moisture environments without leaching out. Anyway, as you can see, the number of earthworm holes that we could go down is unending. I already spoke a bit at the beginning of my introduction about these 2 different models of plant nutrition. One is that plants absorb simple ions. The second is in the form of microbial cells and microbial metabolites. I spoke about nitrogen management, nitrogen utilization efficiency. I didn't realize I had this duplicated here. Then we have the optimal is for nitrogen absorbed as amino sugars through the rhizophagy cycle. Now, what is the rhizophagy cycle? How many of you have heard of the rhizophagy cycle? All right, quite a number of you have. Awesome. So, this is based on Dr. James White's research at Rutgers University over the last 15 years. I'm really intrigued by it. The short run, I'll give you a very rapid overview of the rhizophagy cycle. So, Dr. James White's research indicates that as you have a growing root tip that is growing through the soil profile, that root tip is actually very porous. It's very open. And plants will absorb bacteria and live bacterial cells Well, this laser was working earlier, but maybe I don't see it on the white background. At any rate, you can see the root tip at the far right. Bacterial cells will move into that growing root tip and then move back. And actually, it's not technically correct, I don't think. Well, actually, maybe it is. I take that back. Bacterial cells will move backwards through the root system as this root system continues to grow forward. And as it moves back through the root system, the plants will release oxidizers, reactive oxygen species. Think of hydrogen peroxide or nitrous oxide. So they release these reactive oxygen species and they strip the cell membranes off the bacteria. So now you have these bacterial cells that don't have a membrane. And then these bacterial cells, as they move through all the various parts of the plant, they will move up against a plant cell, and through this process is called endocytosis. The plant cell will surround and kind of envelop that bacterial cell, and the plant cell, for lack of a better term, will swallow or inhale the entire bacterial cell. So that entire bacteria is now inside the plant cell, and now the plant cell starts taking it apart, and it will use some of its proteins and the enzymes and the nucleic acids inside that bacteria to form its own cells and as an energy source. So this is how plants get nutrition from biology. But then what is really interesting is that some of the bacteria that are absorbed from the root system survive this process. They start accumulating about 3 to 4 inches back from the growing root tip. There is often this local accumulation that starts happening of these naked bacterial cells. And at that point, 3 to 4 inches back, the plants will begin releasing or growing root hairs. As they grow root hairs outward, the bacteria that are now these naked bacterial cells will move out through the root hairs and back into the soil environment. And the plant, when it releases these naked bacterial cells back into the soil environment, it also gives them the exact requirement of carbohydrates and mucilage-forming compounds that they need to reform their cell membranes. It's exactly the compounds they need to reform cell membranes. It's like there's no manufacturing required. The plant, the cells, the bacterial cells, when they go back into the soils, can just re-envelop themselves in a cell membrane very, very quickly. And then, while the bacteria is going through this process, it's being absorbed by the root system and moving back out through the root hair and into the soil profile, while it is making that transition, the plant is communicating to the bacteria exactly what their nutritional requirements are. It's telling the bacteria, hey, I need more zinc, I need more manganese, I need more phosphorus. And the bacteria move back out into the soil environment and they transmit that signal. This has been very well measured and described. They will transmit that signal of what the plant's requirements are to the entire soil microbial community in a matter of about 24 hours. In 24 hours, all the soil biological network in that entire root system knows that this plant needs more zinc and more manganese and more phosphorus. Isn't that amazing? So then, they will go out and I mentioned earlier that these plants are also sending out these root exudates of sugars and other compounds. And so plants will go out and they will selectively and preferentially, they will extract more zinc, more manganese, more phosphorus. They will get more of exactly what the plant requires. And then as that root system continues to grow, the plant, those growing root tips, will absorb more of that bacteria and get those nutrients. Isn't that incredible? Isn't that incredible? That's how these systems were designed to work together. And by the way, that means that plants are not vegetarians. Plants are farming bacteria in exactly the same way that we farm livestock. No, actually, they're doing it much better than we farm livestock because they're also able to communicate what their needs are from a nutritional profile, and we tend to ignore that. At any rate, different conversation. So, this process is, I'm delighted that this is so clearly described in the scientific literature at this point because it provides the foundation, as I pointed out, for a completely different understanding and a completely different model of plant nutrition. And this is much more energy efficient. When I spoke about getting to level 3 of the plant health pyramid and producing these high levels of plant fats and oils, I talked about the differences in in nitrogen deficiency of plants absorbing microbial nitrogen versus nitrate, and prefab compounds instead of trees. That's what this process looks like. So if we get this rhizophagy cycle working in our soil systems, then we can produce really high yielding, high energy content plants without applied fertilizers. So how do we get there? How do we make this happen? Whoops, back up. If you want to dig deeper into this, you can listen to the podcast interview that I had with Dr. James White. I also wrote a couple of articles on the blog and referenced his white papers as well. And he was also, Dr. White was also kind enough to put together an in-depth course on rhizophagy, that is on-kind harvest. So how do we translate this into actual practice? From my perspective, the only reason that we ever need to apply nitrogen is if we have already destroyed the capacity of soil to deliver nitrogen. And I already described that a pound of nitrogen is not all nitrogen forms are equal. And here's another interesting tidbit. There's lots of research out of the University of Iowa and University of Nebraska where they say that of the total applied, I'll call it chemical nitrogen, although I don't quite like that term, but ammonium, nitrate, urea applications, the total that's applied to the soil, consistently, crops only absorb about 40% of it. That's a problem. You know, Gary Zimmer first made this comment to me, and I've thought about it a lot. In the interview, one of the interviews I had with Gary, I asked him the question, if you could wave a magic wand, if there was one thing that you would change, or that you could change, to really produce a significant shift in agriculture, what would that be? And he said, I would make nitrogen so expensive that people can't afford to use it unless it's an absolute desperate requirement. Well, we've gotten a lot closer to that in the last year, which quite frankly, I'm happy about. Why? Because, first of all, nitrogen is used to excess. It causes extensive environmental and soil degradation. It causes all kinds of plant health problems. And for goodness sake, it's the one nutrient that we can grow for free. Like the air we're breathing is 78% nitrogen. There's 35,000 tons of nitrogen in the atmosphere above every surface acre. Why on earth do we need to buy more? It makes no logical sense. It's a trap that we have been led into. So, if you think about this nitrogen efficiency number, if only 40% of what is applied is actually absorbed by the crop, if you could get applied nitrogen of what is being applied to have 100% or even nitrogen, 90% of that being absorbed by the crop, that means you could automatically cut your application rates in half. And this is the approach that we have taken in our consulting work when working with growers. We have a reputation that we're very grateful for and that we guard very jealously of being able to deliver consistent results with growers immediately the first year. When we talk about a transition to regenerative agriculture, that we don't have the luxury of time to say that we need to go through a 3 to 5 year transition period and hope for economic rewards in the future. It needs to happen immediately from the get-go. And one of the foundational rules that we use is we don't guess about anything that it's possible to test. So we don't guess whether a soil has the capacity to deliver a crop's nitrogen requirements, and we don't guess whether a crop has enough nitrogen. That's what we have sap analysis and soil analysis for. So our approach usually is we'll collect soil analysis, particularly Haley analysis. We'll evaluate what that soil's capacity is to deliver nitrogen. And then during that we'll also look at history and historical management, and we prefer to apply very little, perhaps even no nitrogen at planting. And we wait, and I'm going to use a corn crop as an example. We wait until about V3 to V4, then we start pulling sap analysis, and we see what is this crop's nitrogen requirement actually. And you would be amazed. I would say usually somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 to 70% of the time, we'll go all the way to tasseling with no nitrogen requirement, with the corn crop and the corn plant showing excessive levels of nitrogen all the way through. We've had farmers that have applied 200 to 300 units of nitrogen for years. And we put on no nitrogen, and the plants tell us that they need no nitrogen all the way up until the tasseling stage or even a bit after, and they cannot comprehend that could actually exist because we've been indoctrinated to believe that we need all this nitrogen requirement, and when in fact, soil analysis are a very powerful and useful sales tool for fertilizer reps. Anyway, so the key is, there's another concept here that is important. I mentioned, this is an important part of the transition process. I mentioned that we prefer to avoid nitrogen applications at planting. This is in fact a really big deal. This is critical to starting the conversion process. Why? Because when I describe the rhizophagy cycle of bacteria feeding plants and providing them with nitrogen, providing them with phosphorus and other nutrients, a key part of this process is that is the first 14 days after a seed germinates. So in that first 14 days after germination, the root system is being colonized by bacteria. So some bacteria should come on the seed unless the seed has been nuked with fungicides and seed treatments, which is not healthy, but unfortunately what most of it is. So that means that in many cases, seed has to recruit biology from the soil. It has to go out and identify as that seedling, the root tip grows. It has to encounter all these different bacteria and the mycorrhizal fungi and everything else and build this microbiome in the root system in the first 14 days. That first 14-day period is critical because what is established in the first 14 days then expands and grows, because after that first 14-day period, the root system starts growing really fast. And if you don't get colonization in the first 14 days, the biological community never catches up to root system development. So the root system grows faster than the microbial community can grow. So that first 2 weeks becomes really important. The best way to prevent that colonization from happening in the first 2 weeks is to apply water-soluble nitrogen and phosphorus around the seed at planting. And you will completely shut down that colonization process. Why? You'll shut it down because the plant now gets the signal that, hey, I have abundant nitrogen and I have abundant phosphorus. I don't need to give sugars to these bacteria. I don't need them. I don't need you. I've got plenty of nitrogen and phosphorus. And then whatever fertilizer was applied in that furrow or in the 2x2 at planting is depleted in 3 weeks or 4 weeks down the road. And now you have this large root system that is not colonized by bacteria. That's not colonized by mycorrhizal fungi. And you've now created a dependency. That plant is now dependent on applied fertilizer, nitrogen, and phosphorus and other nutrients for the rest of its life cycle. Because the biology can no longer function because it was shut down in that first 2 weeks of plant life. So this is a really important period. So in this pathway of converting nitrogen, so we make recommendations for growers through the transition process. We're often applying liquid 32 or 28 or ammonium nitrate or urea, whatever forms of nitrogen that they're using, and we will make recommendations for specific forms to be used. But our goal is that when we apply fertilizer nitrogen to the soil as a side dress, we do not want it early on at planting, but if we're applying it a month later, 2 months later, if we're applying it as a side dress, we want that applied nitrogen to be applied to the soil, and in a matter of days, 3 to 4 days, we want 100% of that nitrogen to be absorbed by bacteria. So in other words, we want to have this bacterial population explosion to tie up all that nitrogen in bacterial cells. When that happens, we now have nitrogen that is plant available, but it's not water soluble. It doesn't leach in water, and it's available in dry weather conditions. So the question is, how do you do that? The pathway to stabilizing nitrogen is by using enough soluble carbon, sulfur, molybdenum. So when you think about carbon and nitrogen stabilize in soil organic matter and living systems, depending on the measurement, you could argue these ratios. You could talk about 20 to 1 or even 15 to 1 or 30 to 1. For the sake of this conversation, we're just going to use 30 to 1. And then we know that we need to have a nitrogen-sulfur ratio in a ratio of about 10 to 1 to produce all of the sulfur-bearing amino acids, which are stop amino acids. And in order to have complete proteins in the soil biology, in other words, in order to have stable proteins in bacteria, the bacteria need to have a 10 to 1 nitrogen to sulfur ratio. So if you combine those two ratios, and you look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio to nitrogen to sulfur ratio, then the ratio is 300 parts carbon, 10 parts nitrogen, 1 part sulfur. Now, what does this mean in terms of actual practical management? Oh, actually, there's an important point here. Excuse me one moment, my shoe is coming untied. The point is that when bacteria, when microbes absorb nitrogen from the soil, or from applied nitrogen, that nitrogen will remain water soluble or will continue to convert to nitrate based on the lowest common denominator. Now, what does that mean? Let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that your soil does not have enough sulfur. It's a very common challenge, particularly in our high rainfall environments here on the East Coast. If your soil does not have enough sulfur, and let's say, for the sake of discussion, you have generous organic matter levels, and you put on nitrogen, and you end up with a ratio that instead of being 310:1, let's just say it's 310.5. So you only have half the sulfur required to stabilize all the nitrogen. So what that means is that those 10 units of nitrogen in the middle, as well as the carbon, they will continue to be cycled by the bacteria. In other words, the bacterial population will churn over and will turn that nitrogen over and over through the bacterial digestive process, and you will favor what are called nitrifying bacteria, and they will convert that nitrogen to nitrate, back to water-soluble nitrogen, because you don't have enough sulfur. So it's very important to manage this nitrogen to sulfur ratio in our soil profile. So our solution for this is that when we are applying conventional nitrogen, liquid 32 or 28 or whatever form we're using, we always add ammonium thiosulfate, 120026, in a ratio so that we have 10:1 nitrogen-sulfur ratio in the applied product. So as an example, that would be about 10% of the solution of liquid 28. So our ratio would be 90-10, 90% liquid 28, 10% 120026. That'll give us a 9:1 or 10:1 ratio of nitrogen to sulfur. So this provides the sulfur requirement so that biology can quickly convert the applied nitrogen to amino acids and into microbial cells. The second piece that we add is we add humic substances. If you're using potassium hydroxide extracted humic substances, which are most of what are available in the marketplace, it takes about 5 to 7% of the total nitrogen solution to bind all of the different nitrogen that is present, different forms of nitrogen. If you're using humicarb, which is an AEA product, it takes about 3% because ours is extracted differently and has a lot stronger binding power than many of what are available in the marketplace. Then in addition to that, we also add molybdenum, because I spoke about molybdenum being the nitrate reductase enzyme cofactor. So we add about 1 pint per acre of rebound molybdenum as a general rule. Of course, we're also testing for this with sap analysis and soil analysis. So in some cases, this is 0, and in some cases, it might be a quart or more. And then we add rejuvenate at 5% of nitrogen solution volume. So for both the humicarb and the rejuvenate, the math for this can be either weight, or it can be volume. It doesn't really matter. There's not significant differences. The rejuvenate, if you're not familiar with that product, it is a combination of molasses and enzymes and humic substances, and it really, the key for the reason for the rejuvenate is that it really triggers bacterial populations to grow very, very quickly. Now, if you look at this combination of what I'm describing, the additions of humicarb and rejuvenate are not anywhere close to enough to supplying enough carbon to give us a 300:10 carbon to nitrogen ratio. That's not their intent and their purpose. Their purpose is to serve as a stimulant to really stimulate soil biology, and that soil biology will then use carbon from the soil organic matter profile to give us that 300:10 ratio. So, there's the formula altogether. This is where you should be taking notes. When growers use this, We consistently cut our nitrogen recommendations anywhere from 30 to 60% right out of the gate. Remember, typical applied nitrogen, crops only utilize 40%. If we can change that to 90% efficiency, that means we can cut application rates in half and produce the exact same crop yields. And that is what we have observed with this combination, is that when we combine, when we put on this combination with liquid nitrogen applications, that applied nitrogen is rapidly converted into bacterial proteins, and it's available to plants. It's not water soluble. You have very high efficiency. None of it runs down the river. And you can cut your nitrogen application rates in half most of the time and not have any negative crop consequences. In fact, usually we expect to see yield responses from this, not a negative. So this is actually kind of a big deal. Are there any questions on what I've talked about so far? All I can say is if you have no questions, nitrogen prices are not high enough yet. Yes?
I was wondering that ratio you said earlier, 310 to 1 sulfur, is that just on the applying something, or is that?
The ratio of 300 carbon, 10 nitrogen to 1 sulfur is what you want to have in the soil profile. So it's not necessarily that you need to apply that exact ratio. In fact, we're not applying anywhere close to that amount of carbon. But we are applying that nitrogen to sulfur ratio, and if you have soils that are depleted in sulfur, you may actually want to apply a higher sulfur level than that. You might want to apply an 8 to 1 nitrogen to sulfur ratio or something like that. Yes?
Are you using like a Haney test to determine what the soil profile is?
Yes, very good question.
SAP analysis determines
Yeah.
the plant response.
The question was, are we using Haney analysis to evaluate the crop's nitrogen requirements? Or the better way would be to say that, to evaluate the soil's capacity to deliver nitrogen. And the answer is yes, we are. And we combine that usually with SAP analysis. And the reason we combine the two is because the Haney analysis is known to be variable based on soil moisture content. If you pull that sample and you haven't had rain for 2 weeks, or if you pull it 2 days after heavy rain, you're going to get very, very different results. And so we keep that in the back of our mind. So we usually pair the two of them just to make sure that we're staying safe. And this is also, with the use of SAP analysis, every 2 weeks through the growing season, we're able to actually monitor how the plant is absorbing nitrogen into the future. If we think about corn as an example, I mentioned earlier that most times growers see nitrogen levels in corn on SAP analysis be maintained at generous levels all the way up to the tasseling period with no nitrogen application. That happens on 80% of the farms that we work on, just consistently over and over again. And this is new farms that are going through the transition period. And the simple reason for that nobody in the industry will ever tell you, is that the crop's nitrogen requirements up through the tasseling stage are very minimal. We're talking about 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen requirement for a corn crop up until tasseling. The heavy nitrogen requirement occurs during the grain fill stage. So why are you applying nitrogen? If you want to really question it as stupidity, the question is, why are we applying nitrogen in the fall for the next year's crop when it's filling grain in July and August? Why, for goodness sake? 80% of it's going down the river at that point. It makes zero sense. Actually, it makes sense for the guys selling the fertilizer. That's the problem. So if we want to dig into this topic even more deeply, this not just related to nitrogen but also to potassium. I had an awesome interview with Rick Mulvaney from the University of Illinois. And so in this conversation up to this point, I've focused on nitrogen because it is the one nutrient, one of the two nutrients that is most over-applied and causes the greatest crop damage to farmers. See, here's another interesting point, going down another earthworm hole here, but an important one. We've been indoctrinated into this perspective that fertilizer applications always, or I shouldn't say always, but fertilizer applications, the great majority of the time, have a positive impact on crop yield. It's like, that's just an expectation, that's an assumption. You put on fertilizer applications, you should get a yield response, right? Except what if that's not actually true? Rick Mulvaney and a couple of his colleagues, students, grad students, conducted an exhaustive review of all the published literature on potassium fertilization, looking at potassium chloride applications specifically. I don't recall if they included potassium sulfate. It's been a while since I read their paper. I think it was mostly on potassium chloride. And exhausted, they reviewed over 600 papers that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature on the effects of potassium chloride fertilization. Of those 600 papers, how often do you think potassium chloride fertilization produced a positive yield response? 4% of the time. 4%. This is in the peer-reviewed literature. They looked at all the studies they could find. 4% of the time, potassium fertilization produced a yield response. Well, the other side of the story is that before I was even aware of this research, we had observed this phenomena with plant sap analysis. See, the approach of mainstream agronomy for the last 70 years has been to apply plant nutrition based on the law of the minimum. You've all heard of the law of the minimum. You may have seen Liebig's barrel, the barrel with the broken off stave with different nutrient levels in it. Have you guys seen that? You know what I'm talking about? All right. So there's this common description that it is the nutrient which is in least supply that is going to limit crop yield. You know, the funny part of it is I have never yet seen one of those barrels with water or carbon dioxide on it. But those are the two most common significant limiting factors. But that as an aside, that very simplistic point of view, and so the approach, what this translates to in practical management is we take a soil test, we take a tissue analysis, we take a sap analysis, and we add whatever is missing. That's the approach, right? Except that approach completely misses the other side of the coin, the other half of the equation. There is also, in addition to the law of the minimum, there's also the law of the maximum. And the law of the maximum states that it is the nutrient which is in excess supply that creates deficiencies of something else that is the greatest yield limiting factor. And here's the crazy part. We now have several million data points from sap analysis on 50 plus different crops for the last decade, and I can state with absolute certainty that the biggest yield and quality limiting factors on crops are the excessive applications of potassium and nitrogen at the wrong time. Fertilizer applications can have a yield drag effect, and they often have a significant yield drag effect. This is very pronounced. I know there's a number of fruit and vegetable producers in here, so I'm going to elaborate on this just a little bit. This is less pronounced on broadacre crops, although it's also relevant, but it's very important for high-value fruit and vegetable crops. The reason potassium is so important is because that in the plant, potassium and calcium antagonize each other. So if you have a plant that has high levels of potassium or a soil that has high levels of potassium, it will prevent calcium from moving into the fruit or into the plant effectively, and it will prevent calcium from moving into the fruit. This is a really big deal for 2 weeks after a blossom pollinates. So if you're growing tomatoes or peppers or any type of crop, and the same is true of grain and soybeans and commodity crops as well, but after pollination, for a 2-week period, you have this small fruit or seed embryo is going through what is called the cell division process. So once the first cell is fertilized, it divides, you have 2, and then it goes to 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. You get this very rapid proliferation of cells. That period will last about 10 to 14 days, depending on environment and temperature and water and moisture conditions and so forth. If you want to have a large fruit, or if you want to have a firm fruit that is really firm and has good shelf life and storability, or grain, then you want to have as many cells during that 2-week window as possible. The limiting factor for the number of cells in that 2-week window is calcium supply, because calcium is needed to form all the cell membranes. The historical view, which has now been proven to be incomplete, but the historical view is that 90% of all the calcium contained in a mature fruit, take a tomato as an example. When a tomato is 4 inches in diameter, 90% of all the calcium in that fruit got into that fruit when, in the first 2 weeks, when it was the size of a .22 caliber bullet. So that 2-week window calcium supply is critical. You want to know how to shut that off? It's very easy. It's really easy. Just apply potassium fertilizer. If you apply potassium fertilizer, it will prevent calcium from going into that embryo, and the result is you will get soft fruit, you will get smaller fruit, you will get fruit that does not have a good shelf life and does not have good storability, and the list of negative characteristics goes on and on and on. There's this one case study, after we discovered this critical nutrient interaction, the first farm that we put it into practice on was a cherry farm in the Pacific Northwest who had the practice of putting on foliar applications of triple 20, 5 pounds per acre of triple 20 every 10 days, starting at bud break in the spring. And that was our first recommendation we made to that farm, is you have to stop the triple 20 applications. Do not put on a foliar application that contains potassium until we get past that cell division period. Once we're 2 weeks past blossoming and pollination, you can put on all the triple 20 you want. This farmer loved triple 20. He used to buy it by the semi-truckload. And he was very hesitant about our recommendations. So he split a block. And on half the block, he did not put on triple 20 until after we told him he could put it on. And the rest of his 370 acres continued to get triple 20. That split treatment, because where he did not put on the triple 20, his potassium levels in the SAP analysis were about half of where the triple 20 was applied. His calcium content in the SAP analysis as a result was about double, and it moved into the fruit much more effectively. He ended up with larger fruit and firmer fruit that had better shelf life and storability that resulted in increased profitability of $1,600 per acre. Now, why does that story matter? Because we didn't add anything. We did not add fertilizer to make that happen. We took away fertilizer that was being applied at the wrong time. That is fertilizer having a yield drag effect. It happens way more commonly than you would think. All right. That's the conclusion. We're going to stop there. If any of you want to follow up, you can. There's a website where I put blog posts on and kind of organizes and brings everything together that I talk about all in one place. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. Obviously, I spent way more than 15 minutes, I think. I apologize for that. But you're welcome to ask me any questions about anything that you would like. I don't promise to answer all of them, though. Yeah, so the question is, what do I want the calcium to potassium ratio to be, and do I want those ratios to change at different stages of plant development? Did I understand that correctly? Yeah. So, first of all, tissue analysis is not going to show you the calcium to potassium ratio accurately. You were talking about SAP analysis. So the calcium to potassium ratio is going to vary a little bit from crop to crop, and I don't remember what they are for tomatoes specifically for other crops right off the top of my head, but we have created those desired values about exactly where we need to be. But here's another important aspect. So I'm talking about the calcium to potassium relationship and how that can be screwed up by putting on potassium fertilizers at the wrong time. The key, though, is the question becomes, what if you are growing a crop like tomatoes that blossoms and pollinates for an extended period? Like, it's unlike corn or small grains where you have all of that happening in a few days. So the key is managing boron and manganese, specifically manganese. So we have discovered and observed that the best way to describe it is to say that manganese, when a plant has adequate levels of manganese, manganese serves as the potassium thermostat for the plant. When you have high levels of manganese in the plant, first of all, it will make the plant more efficient at absorbing potassium from the soil, if that's needed, or it can suppress and shut down potassium absorption from the soil when the soil has excessive levels. And even once the potassium is in the plant, it can prevent the surplus potassium from going from the leaves into the embryo. So this is actually a really big deal. And it's a really big deal because our soils, 95+% of our agricultural soils are oxidized, and they have abundant levels of manganese, but in an inaccessible form. So it becomes important to supplement manganese with foliar applications until we shift and change soil biology so that we don't need it anymore. All right. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, you're asking what is the optimal way to manage nitrogen applications in relative to crop requirements, particularly for manure and organic environments. All right. So I'm going to take the long way around the mountain to answer your question. First, I think it's important for us to understand our crops' nutrient demand curves. And I spoke briefly about the nitrogen requirement of corn, that there's only somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 25, maybe at most 30 pounds of nitrogen requirement up through the tasseling period. And then when you get to the grain fill period, that's when you have the majority of nitrogen supply requirement. And the same is true of potassium, by the way. So if that is the case, then let's, for the sake of discussion, say that our soil is not capable of supplying the crop's nitrogen and potassium requirements. And by the way, we could use this to also talk about calcium or any other nutrient. If the soil is not able to supply the crop's nitrogen and potassium requirements, then we should apply products at a timing point so that the nutrient release curve matches the crop demand curve. How do you do this? If you think about, and these nutrient release curves from applied fertilizer, and I'll get back to talking about manure, the nutrient release curves on fertilizer obviously depend on a lot of factors. They depend on soil moisture and soil microbiology and soil temperature and all these different types of things. But we know that they can be very, very different. So if you take, if we talk about potassium, if you take potassium sulfate versus potassium chloride, we'll use these two in our example. If you apply potassium chloride, the release curve looks something like you will have about 30% availability in 24 hours, and you'll have 90% availability in about 6 to 7 days, and it'll remain fairly highly available for a period of about 3 weeks, and then it starts rapidly dropping off. So for practical purposes, potassium chloride is mostly available immediately after application, 3 weeks after application. So if you're growing a corn crop and your potassium demand is at tasseling, the optimal moment to apply potassium chloride fertilization is going to be about a week before tasseling. That's when you're going to have the greatest potassium release that matches up with the greatest potassium requirement. Now, if you look at potassium sulfate, again, there's variables, soil moisture and so forth. I'm almost hesitant to put these numbers out there because they can vary so much. But generally, potassium sulfate, when you apply potassium sulfate, you'll have about 10% availability starting about 45 days after application. You'll get to 90% availability somewhere in the neighborhood of about 60 to 70 days after application. So if you want to use potassium sulfate and match the demand curve with, match the fertilizer release curve with the crop demand curve, potassium sulfate will need to be applied about 30 to 45 days before potassium chloride in order to get the same crop effect. All right? This actually, I'm going to go back to talking about the calcium to potassium relationship because this is a really, really big deal if you're producing forages or any type of crop. Oh boy. Other important stuff to talk about. The agriculture, the fertilizer business has become obsessed with selling nitrogen and potassium because it makes a lot of money, because it causes lots of diseases for which they can sell solutions, and also because it produces a nice big flashbang response. It's a very strong visual response. You put on a nitrogen application, you can see it visually. For some reason, we've become addicted to the visual. But at any rate, I'm going to go into a separate topic, and I am going to come back to manure application eventually. The separate topic is there are 4 nutrients which make plants grow vegetatively very rapidly, that build a lot of biomass. Only 4. Not 10 or 20 or 50, but 4 specifically. Those 4 are nitrate nitrogen, potassium, chloride, and calcium. So, If you're growing an alfalfa crop and you want to make it grow very quickly, what do? We put on an application of potash, potassium chloride. We get very rapid vegetative growth. If we want to fertilize a corn crop and have it grow very quickly, we put on a nitrogen application. It converts to nitrate. We get very rapid vegetative growth. Same for soybeans or any other crops. If we apply, it has the many soils and crops, because of the way that they've been managed, have become addicts to some combination of nitrogen, potassium, and chloride. However, nitrogen, potassium, and chloride have a synergistic relationship with a plant hormone called auxin. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but let's just say that very simply, that when you apply those three nutrients, they trigger very rapid vegetative growth with very wide node spacing. So you'll have soybean plants that'll be 48 inches tall with nodes 6 inches apart. You'll have alfalfa plants that have nodes that are 4 or 5 inches apart. So you have this very wide node spacing as a result. And also the challenge, of course, is you have disease susceptibility, you have insect susceptibility, you have lower quality forages, you have all these problems that result from excess of nitrogen and potassium fertilization. But here is the secret that is largely unknown. And that is that you can produce the exact same crop of growth with calcium as you can with nitrogen, potassium, and chloride. Except there is one huge difference. And the difference is that calcium has a synergistic relationship with the plant hormone called cytokinin and not auxin. And those two compete with each other. So, let's say in the case of an alfalfa crop, you don't apply excessive levels of nitrogen and potassium, and instead you use calcium as a fertilizer. So here's the thing. We have been trained to think about calcium as a soil amendment. We should think about calcium as a fertilizer, exactly the same way that we think about nitrogen or potassium as a fertilizer. So when you apply, or when you, I shouldn't say apply, but when you supply enough calcium to serve as a fertilizer, you can get the same speed of plant growth as you can with nitrogen or potash. You can get the same volume in the same amount of time, but there will be one dramatic difference. Instead of having nodes on an alfalfa plant 6 inches apart, now they'll be 2 inches apart. Because calcium has a synergistic relationship with cytokine, you get this very tight node spacing. This is how you can get soybean plants with nodes that are 1.5 inches or 2 inches apart and having 6 beans per node, is by getting your growth energy from calcium instead of getting growth energy from nitrogen or potassium. This is a really, really big deal. This is something that we use to tremendous effect in tree fruit production or in green bean production or all these crops on an apple tree. The future reproductive potential of a branch, or this is true of cherries or any of the spur-bearing plants. Let's use cherries as an example. The future productive capacity of a branch is based on how many spurs, how many clusters it can have in the future on that branch and at what spacing. So if you have a 4-foot branch that has spurs spaced every 6 inches versus a 4-foot branch that has spurs spaced every 2 inches, the tree at 2-inch spacing will produce 3 times more fruit for the same amount of branch space the following year and well into the future, not just the following year, but for the next 6 years or as long as those spurs survive. So having close node spacing is a really big deal on tree fruit, on soybeans, on tomatoes. We want to have this tight node spacing and high reproductive potential. And you can do that by using calcium as a fertilizer instead of using nitrogen or potassium as a fertilizer. So now, how do you do that? In this case, you manage the calcium release curve of a product that you're applying to match up with the crop's demand curve. All right? So I'm going to give you 2 examples to give you kind of an illustration of this. Let's say you're growing tree fruit. So cherries, apples, pears, whatever tree fruit, they're going to blossom in early spring. Come out of dormancy, the first thing that happens is they bloom and blossom and pollinate, and right after that you have your cell division period. So if it's true that 90% of calcium goes in at the bloom and pollination, we want peak calcium supply early spring, right at bloom and pollination. That's when we want peak calcium supply. Now compare that to a corn crop. If we're growing a corn crop, then we don't want peak calcium supply in April or May. We want peak calcium supply in late June or July. So our calcium supply is going to be different. Now let's, just for the sake of conversation, say that we want to use gypsum as a fertilizer source of calcium. And to supply enough calcium to give us a strong flush of calcium response, we need 200 pounds of gypsum per acre. The demand curve, or the release curve for gypsum, with all of its inherent variation, is going to be, gypsum is going to start releasing about 30 days after application. You're going to get a peak about 45 to 60 days after application. So, for gypsum as a calcium fertilizer on apples, when do you apply it? In the fall or in the spring? You need to apply it about 60 days before bloom and pollination, which is in early spring. You need to put on your gypsum applications in February or March on a tree fruit crop. If you're using gypsum as a calcium fertilizer on a corn crop, it needs to be applied just before planting. And this is where we have missed the mark. And I say we collectively, this has been something we've learned in the last 4 or 5 years. Many farmers in the biological/organic agricultural space have used gypsum, and they have used other soil amendments, and they've gotten some crop responses, and they've gotten some soil improvement responses, but we have usually missed out our opportunity for the biggest crop response by applying it at the wrong time. Gypsum is usually applied in the fall, and that is usually not the time that we should apply it to get the greatest crop response. So we want to match up the release curve of our soil amendments with the crop's greatest demand curve, and you can expect to get significantly greater crop responses from matching that up. So, bringing this conversation all the way around the mountain to talk about manure applications. What this means for manure applications, in the case of nitrogen and or potassium, the potassium that's in the manure is, again, there's variation based on the type of manure, but speaking in broad brush strokes, the potassium that's in manure is going to release very rapidly. You're going to have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 70 to 80% release within 30 days of application. The accurate way of stating that, we know that there's some residual carryover effect into future years as well, but for what is going to be released in the current growing season, the majority will be released about 30 to 45 days after application. So in that case, if you were putting on a manure application and relying on that as a source of potassium, then putting that on in the fall for the next spring's crop is a misalignment of nutrient release versus nutrient requirement. Now, nitrogen is a bit of a different story, because if you follow the process that I talked about and you get all that applied nitrogen, even in the form of manure, to be absorbed by microbes and by bacteria, then that nitrogen is now no longer leachable. It's not going to disappear. So what this means, we actually do a fair amount of work with manure management. You guys have liquid manure here and there? How many have liquid manure? Oh, mercy, guys. The entire point is to keep the manure out of the water. Why are we putting it in the water in the first place? You must be from a Lancaster background, and I love razzing those guys every time I go out there. So first of all, liquid manure can, I'll mention this briefly because it's relevant. Liquid manure can be extremely toxic to soil biology. And the best way to create really toxic liquid manure is to run the milk house washed water, waste material, with all the chemicals in it, into the liquid manure pit. You will create all kinds of problems and weeds and insects and diseases, and it's such a bad idea. So liquid manure can be really toxic, or it can be the best type of compost tea that you can imagine based on how you manage it. And so I actually have an article on the blog, actually a couple of them, where I talk about manure management and how to turn liquid manure into liquid gold. And essentially it's similar to what I described for liquid nitrogen. We apply microbial inoculants and biostimulants, particularly the humicarb, rejuvenate, and then an inoculant called OP8 into the liquid manure pit. And you can stabilize all the nitrogen in a liquid manure pit and have it be digested really well. A healthy liquid manure pit will have no odor. It will have no sludge. It will have no cap on the top. it will be completely liquid and it smells good. And it's not that difficult to achieve that. And then you have a really high quality product. Everything that I just said about liquid manure can also be applied to some degree to dry manure. That you can have the types of amendments and types of materials you have. You can convert liquid manure, or, manure from a material that, let me say it this way. If you were to rank, how can I illustrate? When manure is treated well, whether in the liquid or dry form, if we have high quality raw materials and we treat it with microbial inoculants and stabilizers, you can have a 4 to 5 times greater crop response and soil health response from well-managed manure as from mismanaged manure. It's a significant, significant difference. It's very worthwhile investing some time and money into. And actually, there's a question that came up at break time about the use of poultry manure, and I want to address it because it's something else we've discovered recently. It's a really big deal. Approximately 4 or 5 years ago, a number of growers that we were working with started getting negative crop responses from poultry manure, where we actually had one farmer that put on pelletized poultry manure at a rate of about 400 pounds per acre on pasture and killed the pasture. Like, how do you do that? So we tried to understand what was happening, what was going on. We analyzed the manure, and we discovered these extraordinarily high aluminum levels. Aluminum levels in the neighborhood of about 40 to 60 pounds per ton of aluminum. And in digging further, we discovered that there was poultry producers were just starting to use a new product, which name I can't recall right now, but they're using ammonium stabilizers or ammonium binders to bind ammonia in the manure that are aluminum based. And so poultry manure increasingly has really high levels of aluminum in it and is actually producing a negative rather than a positive crop response. So for those of you using poultry manure, beware. Find out what's actually in it before you apply it to your crop. All right, again, my answer took entirely too long. I think we've got time for one more question. Yes, Guy?
With manure in a compost system, what is your feeling about adding soil amendments? Does that make them more available?
Very good question. So the question was, what about adding soil amendments to manure or in a composting system? In general, I'm usually fairly cautious about applying materials that have a significant impact on pH, like calcium carbonate or limestone. So I'm cautious about that. But in terms of adding rock phosphate or gypsum or those types of materials into manure or into a composting system, you will dramatically increase the bioavailability of whatever you add in, and you can cut application rates. You will have, again, you have about a 4 or 5x increase in crop response. We expect to see a similar crop response from 200 pounds of gypsum or 200 pounds of rock phosphate combined and blended with manure as we do from 1,000 pounds straight applied. So in terms of economics, it's a significant economic gain to combine and blend nutrients into a manure composting process. All right, I'm guessing there's probably lots of questions that we haven't got to, but I look forward to more interactions later over lunch and at break. Feel free to come up. And also, I missed mentioning it, if you want to follow up, you can connect with my company at Advancing Eco-Agriculture, or also there's a distributor that we work with in Pennsylvania that I know works with a number of farmers here in the area called Keystone Bioag, and I'm happy to give you their contact information if you would like that, if you want to, if I miss any questions for the day today.